Welcome back to the Midwestern Archaeology Podcast. My name is Lee Strange, and today I'm very pleased to welcome author, educator, and podcaster Jason Pentrail. Jason is an author whose work explores the ancient peopling of the Americas, the cultures that followed, and the many stories that connect us to the distant past. His interests extend beyond archaeology into natural history, particularly the study of extinct marine species of the southeastern United States, a subject he has researched and taught for decades. Jason has spent the last 7 years working in environmental science with a focus on marine conservation and stewardship. His background in environmental science, combined with his passion for archaeology, anthropology, and cultural studies, provides a unique perspective on the landscapes and cultures he studies. This vision is shared through his work with the Seven Ages team, where he contributes articles and educational content focused on history, archaeology, and science. In addition to his writing, Jason is a co-host of the Seven Ages audio journal, where he discusses developments in archaeology, history, science, and cultural studies with audiences around the world. In addition to all that, he just recently published several volumes on the Adena, a culture that we are going to be discussing here today on MAP that we're really excited to discuss with him.
Well, I appreciate it, Lee. It's great to be here, and thanks for reaching out. I'm excited for the conversation today.
Awesome. Great. Yeah. So just to get us started out, I'm curious about your own personal journey, Jason. How did you initially get interested in not just Midwestern archaeology, but archaeology as a whole?
Well, a lot of folks, when they're asked this question, you'll hear that, well, I didn't really know about anthropology or archaeology until I got to college and I switched my major and became it was a little bit different for me. I was born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, which is, just loaded with history, Native American cultures, Revolutionary War, Civil War. I mean, we've got the whole gambit of history here. And so being raised in such a unique place full of old historical sites, old archaeological digs and things of that nature, shell rings out on the coast, and just all of the wonderful archaeology we have here, I was intrigued from the youngest age that I can remember, which is about 6 years old. So my parents would take me around to various, historical places, and I was always eyes on the ground, looking for things, interested in things, spending hours in the museum, even after my parents are like, "Come on, we got to go. We've been here all day." I was like, "Oh, 5 more minutes." So it's just been a lifelong passion, history and discovery, and just really interested in how people lived before us at different times, how they adjusted to the world in which they lived, and particularly for Native American indigenous cultures, just the idea of living off the land and being sort of involved in that type of lifestyle was, beyond fascinating to me. So that really drove my attention from a young age. Fast forwarding, I knew I wanted a career in archaeology. However, I was trying to go to school at night full time and work full time and do all of those things, and I ended up my credits were coming too slow. I ended up joining the U.S. Coast Guard, and I was in the Coast Guard for 21 years. During that time, I had opportunity to pursue my education, so I got my bachelor's and my master's degrees. Unfortunately, at that time, because of military service and deployments and things, I was unable to attend field schools and things that I needed to do to get my anthropology and archaeology degrees. So I ended up in the field of environmental science, something else I was very passionate about. But I made a point that once I got, stationed to different places, I would always seek out the local historical groups, archaeological groups. Got to know some of the premier Southeastern archaeologists who took me under their wing, mentored me, brought me out on field schools, allowed me to volunteer, taught me the proper way to excavate. And I've even ended up teaching graduate students since that point
Wow.
on how to excavate properly and all of those things. So it's been a wonderful experience, and they really could see that I was passionate about it. So ultimately, that led to about 10 years ago starting the Seven Ages Audio Journal, where I wanted to report on the stories and bring these stories to attention. I found that with the quickness and the fastness of social media, stories pop up and then they're gone, stories pop up and then they're gone. I wanted something where we could explore the world of archaeology more in depth, where we could bring on, professionals, people that are at the top of their game in their professions, and just really understand archaeology on a deeper level. And so it's grown and it's continuing to grow. But we were very diligent about who we bring on and the topics that we cover. But we really want it to be an education source. Yeah, a good entertaining conversation, but we also want people to, at the end of the episode, really walk away with something going, wow, I had no idea. Or, Lee, one of the biggest things is creating ownership for people. And that's something that I love to do is you go to an area that's historically renowned or has these incredible archaeology sites, but no one knows about them, even in their own
Yeah.
town sometime. And I think it's a habit of, well, I live here, I could go see it anytime, or I'll get to it. It's right up the road, and then people just never really go explore what's right around them. So we wanted to, bring those sites and the archaeology to people's attention, get them involved, create a community base where I found over the years, if you can get someone who's interested in history and archaeology and they can volunteer on a dig, even if they're just
Yeah.
running a sifting table or whatever it is, being part of that, it creates ownership. And that ownership drives their attention. It tells them, let me tell this story to my kids. Let me tell this to my grandkids. And it also helps them to take ownership in the site so that they look after it, they preserve it. If they see something going on that shouldn't be going on, they'll call somebody, they'll say something.
Yeah.
So it really creates a community around the site, and I think that's really important. And when people can get hands on with archaeology and history, I think that ignites the passion for the future of archaeology. And hopefully, we have a new inspired group of anthropologists and archaeologists coming up here over the next couple of decades. So that's our hope, and that's our mission with Seven Ages Audio Journal.
That's awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with ARI, the Archaeological Research Institute, but our mission is actually very similar. We based in Lawrenceburg, and we're all about making archaeology accessible and then also getting people to buy into the history that's right beneath our feet. That people, as you said, aren't really they're taking it for granted if they're even aware of it at all. Most people are not. But yeah, and also that's a goal of our podcast right here. So definitely, we are on the same team in this regard, so that's great to hear. So, kind of bringing our discussion specifically to your most recent work, authoring these Adena books, and I'm curious what drove you to specifically focus on the Adena themselves as a culture, because they're it's not as though they are unheard of, but they are a little bit more niche than, say, the Hopewell or the Mississippians, like at Cahokia. So I'm curious, what drove you to kind of center your research on them?
Yeah, well, no, it's a great question. And really, that is the reason, is because
Oh.
one, the Hopewell generally dominate the conversation in the Ohio Valley.
Mhm.
But let's back up just a moment. So I'm from Charleston, South Carolina. So why am I writing a book about something that's in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia? Well, one of the perks of having a podcast is the aspect of audio journaling. So we like to actually get out on the road. We take these
Mhm.
trips every couple of years where we'll go hit 7, 8, 10 sites on a trip, myself and my other two hosts. And we interview people. We bring all the podcasting equipment with us and we sit down and we talk to the experts. We talk to the people at the sites. And, we produce it that way and we call it audio journaling, where we'll actually go out in the field and do it live from the scene and all that good stuff. So one of these trips took us up to the Ohio Valley. We were there, started at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, and we
Yeah.
had an interview set up with Jim Adavazio and a little short documentary we did with him. We filmed up there as well. But we looked at all of the other sites that were in the region, and that led us to like Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia. And then we just made our way out across Ohio, and we're just hitting, the Hopewell sites, and they weren't UNESCO at the time, but we were well aware of these sites, and we're making a point to try to hit as many down to Chillicothe, out to Serpent Mound, just all over, trying to hit as many places as possible. Um, I had been interested in mound building cultures for quite a while. And so, while most of our shows are on Southeastern to Midwestern archaeology, we do cover a lot of international topics as well, from Egyptology to things from the Middle East to Levant, all of these different areas. But the idea of mound building cultures had always captured my attention. And on that particular trip, I was exposed to so many Adena sites and Adena mounds mixed in with the Hopewell. And at a lot of sites, they would say, okay, well, this is the Hopewell portion here. Then over here is the Adena section, which is older. And something kept drawing me to, I want to go back to the genesis of this idea. Now, we all know that the Adena are not the first mound builders in North America. Poverty Point, Watson Brake, LSU
LFU
Mound,
Mound. Yeah.
those are way, way older. So they're certainly
Mhm.
not the first. But I think it's fair to say that they are the first large scale mound builders that have built them on this
Mm.
uh, quantity. So there's literally, at the time of European exploration, there was thousands of these mounds. As we know, there was something recorded by the Bureau of Ethnology around 10,000 mounds, of which I think there's less than 1,000 today.
Mhm.
Many of those were Adena mounds. Now, of course, some of those are only a foot or two tall. Other ones are massive, like Miamisburg or Grave Creek. And then there's everything in between. So, but the idea of who are these people? Where did these people come from? What kind of kicked off this idea coming out of the late Archaic? So the glacial came, the red ochre
Mm.
cultures, these earlier people who are doing similar things. And you can kind of see that idea of, they're burying people in the Morans and different areas geologically. It's not exactly the same, but there is a precedent that's being set there. But what kind of kicked off this idea of a mound, which is can be thought of as maybe a family plot? We don't know that for sure. Maybe a community centered plot, something where a group of people are coming together. But the fact that the Adena were so different from even what we would see with Hopewell, and certainly different from what we see with Mississippian and Fort Ancient cultures.
Mhm.
So, of course, those are much, much later, and they're building huge ceremonial complexes. But some of the anomalies with the Adena that really piqued my interest were the fact that, first of all, as we know, they weren't called the Adena. That's just a modern term.
Right.
But they were sort of loosely based community. So they weren't necessarily what you would think of today as a tribe. They weren't a designated group that we are this and we
Mhm.
all live in one giant village. So the archaeological record still seems to lack showing much in the way of large villages of people for Adena. They seem to be in small little hamlets, little family groups kind of scattered out across the landscape, but yet they come together at certain times of the year to perform ritual, whether it's solstices, equinoxes, maybe diversify the gene pool a little bit. That's always important. We got to keep those things moving along. Um, but
Absolutely.
there, but there doesn't seem to be any particular chiefdom or hierarchy, or there may have been, but the archaeological record doesn't really indicate clearly that there was a designated leader, that one person was in charge. So it seems like
Mhm.
there's cooperative groups that are practicing a similar ritual, practicing regionalities. So there's little differences between maybe the bluegrass Kentucky Adena versus what we see in Indiana versus what we see in central Ohio. Pretty
Mhm.
similar, but slight little differences. So there's something that's bonding these people. There's something that's connecting these people. And when you get to the really large mounds, it appears that this was likely a community center point. So they felt the need to inter their dead into these mounds in various ways. Some are extended burials, some are cremations, some are bundle burials, which also kind of makes you wonder, why are some cremated? Why are some in an extended burial?
Mhm.
What is the idea here? And there's a lot of different theories on that as well. But ultimately, I wanted to start in the Ohio Valley because of the transitions that you see in Adena. So when we're talking Adena, just like everything else, you have an early, a middle, and a late.
Mm.
And the archaeological record clearly shows a progression along that almost 1,000-year path. So I really wanted to capture that in the books, and it's a 2-volume set. The first volume
Keep going.
is everything that has to do with what we know and what we can make best guesses about concerning the Adena culture. So, ritual landscape. What are mound builders? Where did they live? What can we tell from pathologies and physical remains and dental work? All of these things give us some good insight. What were their rituals most likely associated with? All of these things. That's volume one. Volume two covers all of the accessible records for archaeological sites pertaining
Mm.
to Adena. So, as we all know, the Adena People books, volumes one and two, along with the 1963 publication of Mounds for the Dead by Don Trigou, those are some of the earlier texts that really capture what we call the Adena traits.
Mm.
So those are things that after having excavated hundreds and hundreds of Adena mounds, they said, you know what? We keep seeing these same reoccurring traits. So we're going to make a list of what are specifically Adena, where when we go in a Hopewell mound, we see something different. And so they made these Adena traits. And by listing those out is helpful, but by actually looking at a book that just has all of the archaeological reports and reading those, you can begin to see the traits for yourself.
Mm.
And as an anthropologist or an archaeologist or just anyone who's interested in the culture, you begin to see, okay, what are the most popular traits? What are we seeing that's happening time and time and time and time again? And then when you trace that early, middle to late Adena, you can start to track those changes. And there's some pretty significant changes between an early Adena site and a late Adena site.
Ready to dig into discovery? Join the Archaeological Research Institute with a student or family membership. Whether you're a junior explorer, apprentice archaeologist, college researcher, or a part of the family expedition team, you'll enjoy hands-on experiences, exclusive passes, and a Field Notes magazine packed with stories and activities. Memberships start at just $25, and every level helps support real archaeology in your community. Join today and start exploring at the Archaeological Research Institute.
Jason, if I may ask,
Yeah.
before we jump into the chronology, can we locate the Adena geographically? So I know that we've talked about the Ohio River Valley specifically, but can you give us our bearings as far as geographically what the span of the Adena material complex is, and also where does the Adena kind of phenomenon begin in time?
Okay. Yeah. Great question and great place to start. So, the heartland, if you will, the homeland of the Adena is really about central to lower southern throughout the Ohio River Valley in the heart of Ohio. So that extends down into Kentucky. Over in western West Virginia, there's a very prominent Adena presence along the Kanawha River, all
Mm.
through that area around Charleston, South Charleston, West Virginia, just loaded with Adena sites. So that was a very, very popular area, extending into small portions of western Pennsylvania, and then, of course, eastern Indiana. So you've got sort of that swath of the Ohio River Valley, and some of the contributing river valleys in that area is really where they're strongly centered. Now, it does appear from archaeology that the later Adena seem to occupy a little bit more into Indiana, but really for the beginning of Adena, you're looking at central to southern, mostly southern Ohio throughout that Ohio River Valley. And that's really where we begin to first see the indications of what would be eventually called Adena. And so the earliest sites are going to be found there. And also, there are some down in Kentucky. So it's kind of a scattering throughout that region. But then as we move into mid and late Adena, that it expands and we see an obvious movement into some very surprising places, such as late Adena sites that are in the Delmarva Peninsula, so Maryland,
Mm.
Delaware,
Wow.
places that people don't normally think about Adena, and even some anomalous sites that move up to what they call the Middlesex portion, which goes into southern New York, even possibly parts of Canada. So some of that's
Wow.
still to be confirmed, but there's some very, very good indications. So ultimately, when we're talking Adena, we're talking about the Ohio River Valley, with the strongest concentration coming from West Virginia down into around Chillicothe, Coshocton County, Ohio, that kind of center portion there. So that's really the what we would call the Adena homeland.
This was something that I actually didn't know before I started reading your book, but what's interesting about the Adena is that they are kind of like the quintessential early woodland culture or complex, at least in the Midwest and at least in the world that I inhabit at ARI. The Adena are very, at least when I'm thinking early woodland, I'm thinking the Adena, and then obviously middle woodland, there's still some Adena, but then mainly it's Hopewell. So something that I was surprised to read about was that it seems to be that there's some evidence to suggest a demographic decline during the Adena kind of early period. Can you just briefly talk about what evidence there is to suggest this demographic decline, and does this have any implications on how we understand Adena sites in the early period or in the middle period?
Lee, that's a really interesting portion of research. And it wasn't just necessarily the Adena, it was kind of a regional thing within that whole, within hundreds of miles of that area. And it really can't point your finger to one particular thing that says there was an obvious overt population decline within the Adena, but it's based off of the decline that we see between late Archaic sites and early woodland sites. So from the middle Archaic to the late Archaic, there's just sites everywhere. All along the river valleys, all along the tributaries. They're just plentiful. And we see, it's kind of like one of those deals where you throw a rock and you're going to hit a site type of thing along, and they're exclusively middle to late Archaic. Of course, as we go further back into early Archaic and Paleo, those are much more scarce, but population numbers are really strong during that particular time period. And then as we do that transition between the late Archaic, so you have those glacial came and you have red ochre, and there's a few other kind of spread throughout that area, you begin to see a little bit of a decline in sites. And we can't point to one particular thing. It's probably suspected to be something environmental. However, when the Adena come along, so that's just slightly after the glacial came and the red ochre, and there's probably a good amount of overlap between those two. You see mound building really begin, and you see a change in the artifacts, the grave goods. So from what we're seeing with glacial cane, which are more of what they call sort of the shoe sole shaped pendants and gorgets and things of that nature, we begin to see a new style with the Adena, things that are much heavier, bigger, thicker, heavier pendants, much more robust. And then we see a much more defined burial ritual practice, which would lead some to think that if conditions had worsened, maybe climate-wise, the amount of food and game was on a decline for whatever reason, maybe they felt the need for a higher amount of ritual in order to offset. Kind of what we see with the Mississippians as the climate change begins to change at their cultural centers, Moundville and Etowah, and these places. They really ramp up the ceremonial side of things because they're like, we got to correct this. So we got to really get on the phone with the gods and find out what is going on here. And it could be something along those lines that we see some sort of climate or ecological collapse or even dip, causing them to increase the amount of ritual that's required for them to kind of offset what they think is the cause of those declines. So while there is no smoking gun, as there often is not in archaeology, I think it's a safe assumption that it's something along those lines that prompted the increase in mound building, the increase in ceremonialism, and then it continues throughout over the time of middle and late Adena. We see it get more and more complex. The burials get more complex. The grave goods get more that are put into a tomb. You get to see by the late Adena, which have now blended very well with the Hopewell, we begin to see much more in the way of grave goods, much more elaborate burials, much more on the size and scale of the mounds that are being built. So you can really trace it. Something else that's interesting while we're talking about that is with the early Adena sites, you'll see, generally from the archaeological record, you'll see a mound. And around that mound, there may be some scant remains of not even what we would call a village, but a small settlement, maybe a couple of houses and some of the associated debutage and debris that you would find archaeologically with that. When you get a couple hundred years up the road, you begin to see things like what some people refer to as mortuary camps. So those are now very close proximity to the mound. So now you're finding pits with evidence of ritual feasting. You're finding red ochre. You're finding other pigments and things that are used in the preparation of the bodies being interred into the mounds. And you're seeing an increase in the amount of grave goods. Then by the time we get to late Adena, which have now blended very, very well with the Hopewell, we see all of that personified. So it's greatly increased. Much bigger mounds, much bigger settlements, and way more in the way of ceremonial remains. So a lot more red ochre, a lot more preparation of bodies.
Mm.
And then we do see a good deal of cremations. Now, we don't know if the cremations are just a result of maybe wintertime burials where the ground's frozen and you can't really dig all that well to get them interred into the mound. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe there is a caste system, or maybe there's just a preferred method of burial. Again, these are questions we can't answer from the archaeological record. Um, but there's a significant amount of, so if you take a large mound, say 15, 20 feet tall, there will be a significant mound most times with a lot of charred remains, calcined bone, cremated burials mixed in, usually with an extended burial that's center to the mound, that's usually placed beneath the normal layer of ground, and then the mound's erected on top of that. So there's a lot of changes, a lot of things with the Adena over time. And then, just as a quick side note, once you do see that blending with the Hopewell, uh, you begin to see there are groups of Adena that appear to not want to interact, and they leave. And that's where we account for the Delmarva groups. So those
Mm.
are later, but we begin to see Maryland, Delaware. At first, they were thought to be just trade items, and there's still some people that think that finding these Adena blades and these caches out that way in Maryland and throughout the Delmarva Peninsula are just a result of trade. However, if you look at the book, you will see, there's sites that have produced hundreds of Adena blades. So it's likely not that they were trading finished blades from the Ohio River Valley in the Adena style in the late Adena, because they would have been incorporated into more of the Hopewell styles by then. You're seeing a very distinct group who left and said,
Mm.
"We don't want any part of that. We're going to go over here and do our own thing." And so that in itself is very telling of the Adena, that apparently some of them were willing to intermix with the newcomers, but there were certainly groups that wanted to keep things within the Adena way of life.
Adherence to the old way. Just as a fan of history, there's so many parallels that tempting to draw. When I read that, that was very fascinating as well to me. Anyway, that you have, it seems to be distinct communities of Adena who reject this new Hopewell way of life. But before we kind of discuss maybe more in depth the Hopewell, the Adena connection to Hopewell, I'm curious about the Adena way of life itself. So it may go without saying for those that are kind of in the know about Adena, Hopewell, and then later Mississippian cultures, the Fort Ancient. But did the Adena practice, what sort of subsistence did they practice? Were they hunter-gatherers? Did they stay in one location? Of course, there's going to be variation throughout a region. But I'm just curious what you can tell us about their way of life and how they would have fed themselves, how they would have clothed themselves, or just settlement patterns and stuff like that.
Yeah. So what we see with that transition from late Archaic into the Middle Woodland is, yes, they were hunter gatherers, fishers, things of that nature. But we do begin to see the beginnings of plant domestication. So they weren't large scale agriculturalists like we see with the Mississippian later. So they aren't growing, fields of corn and things of that nature, but they are utilizing, sumpweed and other types of aquatic weeds and plants and things of that nature that really are quite healthy and provide a lot of nutrients and things of that nature. Um, as far as settlement, like we said earlier, they tend to be in small family groups, small community groups, probably not more than 10 people, 10, 15 people in one particular group of houses. But what's interesting about that is, while we said earlier that there doesn't appear to be any particular leader, chief, anything of that nature, there's someone that's able to organize community gatherings. So when it's time to inter someone into a burial, When it's time to go to the sacred circles, which is another earthwork that the Adena were famous for making, we don't know what they were used for, but I'm sure they had something to do with timing of the year, equinoxes, solstices, astral alignments, things of that nature, because that would be in keeping with what we see later with the Hopewell and many other cultures. But as far as their settlement patterns, they're going to be very close to the rivers. They're going to be on those beautiful river terraces that you have there in the Ohio River Valley, that beautiful fertile soil, close at proximity to the travelways. Of course, they're moving up and down the Ohio River and all the tributaries. That would have been the interstate of the day. And we know from the exotic goods that are coming from the Gulf of Mexico, from the eastern seaboard, things like seashells, shark's teeth, things of this nature. We see things coming out of the Appalachians. So we've got mica from North Carolina. We've got copper coming from Michigan, and also has been confirmed here recently, a good bit of copper coming from rare sources in the Appalachians. So they've got things moving in and coming in from various, different parts. People always talk about, the obsidian with the Hopewell coming all the way from Wyoming, and that certainly is impressive. But the Adena were doing it as well.
Mm,
So they were organized enough that they were involved with trade. They were involved with long distance movement of goods along these waterways. And of course, when we're talking about the Adena themselves, what makes them different? And this is really where we get into some of the anomalies, the anomalous
mm,
parts of the Adena, which is also very interesting. Is physiologically, they were different in that they were of average height for the time. Males were 5'5" to 5'6", females were 5'2" to 5'3", but they were very heavy boned, very wide, heavy set jaws, thick bones. Oftentimes, people from the records, especially in archaeological context, from those journals, they'll talk about, man, the muscle attachments on some of these bones are really well developed and they're very
mm,
thick and heavy.
mm,
So they also practice cranial deformation, which is very unusual for North America. Tends to
mm,
be a Central and South American practice. And of course, that's natural, cradle boarding. It's not, there's no ancient aliens involved or anything like that. It's a natural process, but it is very unusual for North America. And we don't really see that with many other cultures, especially at that time in the early woodland.
If I may
So,
ask about the
yeah.
cranial boarding, so what effect does that have on the cranium?
So, this is a process that's began when the child is born, and it begins with
Yeah.
adding pressure on a cradle board. So that's how they would often carry their infants on their backs, kind of like a
Mm,
backpack, but it's a flat board. They would place the head up against that board, and they would strap it, and it would create just a slight pressure. It's probably very uncomfortable, but when you have a young child, of course, their skull sutures haven't solidified yet, and there's still a lot of play and flexibility in the bones. And it just, the brain capacity remains the same. It just
mm,
pushes the skull kind of up and a little bit back to create this sort of elongated look.
mm,
We don't know why. We do see it in, like I said, South American and Central American cultures. We see it in European cultures. So it's not unprecedented throughout the world.
mm,
We see it happen for various reasons, but we don't know if it was sheerly um, a look that is preferred for whatever reason, or if they were owing that back to some deity or to some ceremonial reason that they felt the need to do this. But it was something that was practiced almost exclusively with the Adena, and it's with the burials that
mm.
are described in the book. It's almost every single one.
Wow.
So it's not like a rare thing where 1 out of 3 have it or 50% have it. It's almost every single one that can be examined shows that cranial deformation was practiced. So again, heavy boned people that don't necessarily seem to physically match the late archaic. However, the DNA does seem to match. So we have some good indications of that, but they do seem to be an almost exclusive group that seems to be different from their neighbors. And they do just kind of show up on the scene, but at the same time, we can see where they were getting these ideas from the glacial cane and from the red ochre. So some people, when you're talking Adena, want to proposed that they came from far out in California, that they came from Mexico, and they just showed up in the Ohio River Valley. We can't prove that. So right now, that's just a theory of one of many. But
Mm,
we do know that they were there, they were established in well numbers, and even though there appears to be a population decline, the Adena were able to hold their numbers. They were able to keep birth rates and things high enough that they were able to grow the culture and continue to thrive and expand in the Ohio Valley. As far as the origins of where they may have exactly came from, we don't know because so many haplogroups and DNA lineages for Native Americans are very similar. We
mhm,
do know that from testing with the Hopewell that was compared to mitochondrial DNA from the Hopewell that was compared with a couple of Adena sites that they do share the same lineages. Korea, China, Japan,
mm,
those lineages are very present. So there's no anomalous, like, with the mound builder myths, like they were a lost tribe of Israel or any of that stuff. There's no DNA evidence of anything like that. They are in
mhm.
keeping with the typical haplogroups that we see with Native American lineages. However, they do have these unusual physical traits, and they do practice things that are outside the norm for the early woodland for sure.
Mm. Which is just fascinating. And I remember reading about the head elongation in your book and thinking that that is definitely, yeah, it's very distinct. I remember reading about South American cultures that did that and Central American cultures, but that there's one right here in the Midwest is very interesting. I mean, body modification is very common worldwide, but it seems like there's something very distinct about skull modification that really is a little bit striking.
Want to get more involved in local archaeology? At ARI, we identify, preserve, and responsibly explore archaeological sites in southeast Indiana, southwestern Ohio, and northern Kentucky. Our volunteers are one of the driving forces behind this mission, from participating in archaeological digs, assisting in lab work, artifact processing, and supporting field trips and fundraising. Every role helps us move forward. With just a 1 hour training, you'll gain new skills, meet new people, enjoy nature, and make a real impact. Volunteering with ARI means joining a community passionate about history and preserving it for generations to come. Join us at ARI, be a part of history, be a part of the future.
I wanted to ask you, so to kind of explore Adena culture a little bit more, if anyone knows anything about the Adena, they might know about their mounds and that they are kind of the first in a sequence of Ohio or Ohio Valley, River Valley tradition of mound building, which, goes on with the Hopewell and then later to a lesser extent the Fort Ancient, and then of course the Mississippians. So can you tell us what is distinct about the Adena mounds and what exactly it tells us about their culture? What glimpses into their culture do their mounds allow us?
Well, the mounds themselves are fascinating. And, people have asked me before, well, isn't it just a big pile of dirt? And how does it not erode? And how does it not fall apart after all these years? Well, it's obviously much more than that. There is certainly an engineering to these mounds. The Adena mounds are known as conical mounds. And so, because once they are completed, they have a conical shape to them, and that makes them different from things like Mississippian platform mounds, where they're just flat on the top, or like a loaf mound, like you see sometimes with Hopewell constructions that are more, stretched out and kind of flat across the top. So they tend to be of a classic conical shape. And to really understand them, what we learned a lot is from excavations by people like Don Tragoo in 1963, again, referencing his book, Mounds for the Dead. That was a full excavation of the Crescent Mound in West Virginia, which was a sheerly Adena mound. There was no other intrusive cultures there. So it was a very good case study. And from that, along with others around Cincinnati and different places that have been excavated over the years, talking about those Adena traits. So one of those traits is that we would see the presence of a subterranean tomb, which is, if you take the level ground, they would erect what we call a charnel house or a burn house. And we again don't know what that means. Was it their actual home that the people lived in, and when they passed away, they would be placed into the floor? Probably not, because the archaeology doesn't show a lot of domestic debris. It shows that there was pretty much a structure that would have been built around the person for the purpose of ceremonial burning of the structure. What we see with the Adena is paired posts. So they have two posts right beside each other in a circle. They have poles and walls that are then coming out of 45-degree angles. So they made a very specific type of structure in most of these cases, where they would then burn it down on top of the person. They would then cover that person, place any grave goods or anything that they may want to place in there, and then they would cover it over, and then that would become basically a vertical cemetery. So when the next person was interred, they would place them in the mound, either in extended position, so full body extended out, often with accompanying log tombs. So they would make a log structure around the person. Um, they really used bark exclusively. They used a lot of bark, which leads me to believe that there was something with the trees. There was some sort of connection, either through their rituals and religion, but the trees played a part because you could use many different materials, but they used bark. And so they would lay a bed of bark, place the extended bodies on top of that bark. They would often cover the people themselves with bark, often sprinkling red ochre over the artifacts, sprinkling red ochre over the body. And then again, you cover the body. Well, once they've got about 2 or 3 layers of burials, they would often place a clay cap over the top, and they would burn that, so that once you burn the moisture out of that clay, it becomes like concrete. And so not only does that seal in those tombs, but it also creates a solid foundation for the next layer. So when you inter the next burial, you have a solid foundation. It's not collapsing and things as much as you would think. So they would repeat this process, and we don't know what would make them stop. So maybe the burial mound has reached 15 feet, and all of a sudden they don't use it anymore, and they go make a new one. Now, is that just is it just hard to climb a 15-foot mound to put more dirt on top? But that wasn't the case with Miamisburg at 70 plus feet. That wasn't the case with Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia. So what was the factor that made them say this one is complete? We don't know. But we do know that there is a distinct construction phase, just like we see with Mississippian. There's a layer, there's a reason and a rhyme that they did it the way that they did it. Same thing with Hopewell. So these weren't just, while they were made one basket load at a time, and you can see that when you cut a wall, you can see the individual basket loads and think, wow, somebody literally put that one basket load right there. And then you can see the next one and the next one and the next one. And it's absolutely incredible the amount of work that went into this. But there was a very much a reason, very much a rhyme to why they did it. They would stagger burials. Some would be higher, some would be lower. But we don't know, again, was it a community? Was it a neighborhood? Was it a tribe? There's some good indication from archaeological records that they did practice. They had a practicing medicine man, medicine woman, medicine person. We don't really like to use the word shaman because it's not a Native American term. However, it is one that I think people can relate to. So when you say shaman, I think most people in archaeology, anthropology, or even popular culture have a pretty good visualization of what that means. Someone who is the go-between between the spiritual realm and the physical realm, someone who is a healer, someone who is tasked with exorcism, who is tasked with, uh, the ceremony when someone is crossing over into the spiritual realm from the physical realm. And we have very clear indications of that in the Adena culture, especially with the wolf masks and the regalia that's been found in many, many different places. So we know that they had an established ritual of some sort. We know that they had a ritual landscape that involved the stars, astral alignments, and also pipes that indicate wolves, that indicate ducks, that indicate turtles. So there was, some attachment to the natural world as well. But the mounds themselves are actually very complex constructions, and that's why they are still around today in many cases. And of course, you got to keep in mind that once they abandoned the mound, or once these cultures had moved on, trees began, bushes and things began to grow. Those root systems help hold a lot of that dirt together to keep it from eroding. Gets covered over with grass, gets covered over with a canopy from the trees and everything. And while the root systems and things can be destructive, it also helps hold it all together. So in many of the cases, being early woodland culture, they had, you know, those type of things working in their favor.
Mm.
Really, the biggest amount of destruction came from European colonization of the country, where people didn't know what these mounds were. They're just like, hey, man, we're building Cincinnati and this big old pile of dirt in the way. Let's get this thing out of here. Oh, hey, there's bones in here. And hey, what are these cool arrowheads? And, that's the terms of the day.
Mm.
And, of course, that leads to a lot of the early outlandish mound builder myths and all of that. But ultimately, the lion's share of destruction of the mounds came from farmers and the construction of urban areas. So
Right.
that's really where we destroyed the Adena, but that's also where we learned the most about who this culture was.
Mm. Yeah, and the mounds and from the descriptions in your book, and then also from independent study as well, are super fascinating. I highly recommend any listeners, if you have never read about Adena mounds or Adena cultural practice at all, definitely check out Jason's book because it's really fascinating. It goes into a lot of detail about it. But to kind of continue to talk about Adena culture specifically, there's a kind of artifact that is has fascinated me for as long as I've heard about the Adena, and that is of course, the Adena tablet, where the most famous among them being the Cincinnati tablet. But I'm curious if you can give us a kind of a brief introduction into what these tablets are, what they might represent, and where are they found.
So the tablets, the Adena tablets, are the most enigmatic of all of the Adena artifacts, and they are absolutely incredible and fascinating. So the Adena expressed art in many different ways. A lot of times it would be done through pipes, so smoking pipes, but we don't see a lot of just overt art where you say, here's some stones with engravings, or here are, maybe what we would call a settlement site on a river terrace, but you don't see a lot of engraved pebbles, engraved stones, things of that nature. But what you do see is the Adena tablets. Now, these are generally made of sandstone. They're about the size of a postcard, maybe a little bit bigger. Most of them are that rectangular shape, with a few exceptions, such as the Berlin tablet, which is more of almost like the shape of the body of a violin. It's very, very unique and very beautiful. Some of them just have surface engravings. Other ones are engraved in high relief. And so the Cincinnati tablet, again, was found in Cincinnati during the destruction of one of those mounds that we were just talking about. And at first, it was considered to maybe possibly be a forgery. After further archaeological investigations, and it was checked, and we began to find other ones at different places in Kentucky, West Virginia, throughout the Ohio region. Um, we said, okay, there's something to these. This isn't an anomalous single artifact. So, what they represent from an artistic standpoint, they're not all exactly the same, but they do have similar features, which is raptorial birds, vultures, water, things of that nature. So, there seems to be some connection with the idea, possibly, that the vulture cleans the dead, removes the body. Also, the idea of potentially some symbology referencing the axis mundi, or the center of the earth, the trees, something like we see with Yggdrasil, the tree of life, from the Nordic culture. Not saying that they're connected, but it's that idea of sort of the tree of life, which we also see in Egypt and other places. So again, kind of referring back to that bark that I was talking about earlier, there does seem to be this connection of the trees. The roots go down into the underworld, and the leaves come out into the outer world, and the trunk of the tree is the in between the two realms, the underworld and the overworld. So things of that nature, those type of ideas seem to be prevalent amongst the tablets. Now, another thing that's really, really interesting, and there's about, I want to say, 17 of them that are considered to be fully authentic and really attached directly to the Adena.
Canonical, yeah.
Yes, for sure. But they do share very similar iconography. But something that's really, really interesting about it is the idea that many of them down in the grooves, when you put, like microwear analysis and you really get in there and look at them closely, you'll find traces of red ochre.
Hmm.
And on the back of these, many, many of these have these elongated grooves on the back of the tablet. Some of them, in at least 2 cases, have been found with bone awls.
Hmm.
And you can see that they were sharpening this implement on the back of the sandstone tablet, which has led many to think that it may have been a tattoo template.
Hmm.
So while the actual art itself was representative of their ritual landscape, you dip that in the red ochre, you place that template on the body, you're sharpening something on the back of it for a reason, and now you're putting that tattoo into the skin with either a bone needle or an awl, something of that
Hmm.
nature. And we have a precedent from early European explorers, of course, this is much later, but they talk about Native Americans being very heavily tattooed,
Hmm.
especially down in Florida. Said in some cases they were fully tattooed from their eyebrows to their toes. So body art, body modification certainly is not unusual among indigenous people anywhere in the world. But even here in North America, it's been recorded many, many times.
Mhm.
And so while we don't, at least that I'm aware of, or anything that I was able to access, there is no actual Adena flesh that is preserved that shows anything that we would call a tattoo, but it seems to be a pretty safe assumption
Hmm.
that this would have been a ritual practice. And so we do know that the tablets themselves, again, are made in a certain fashion. They seem to represent a ritual landscape. There's recurring themes, recurring characters. But these particular pieces, they're just beautiful, and they're, of course, included in the books. The Wilmington tablet is another beautiful example, a great example. Of course, the Cincinnati is probably the most popular and well known. Very, very beautiful. That's why it's on the cover of the book. So if you look at the covers of the book, you'll see that the Cincinnati tablets are there in alternating colors. I did the volume 1 with the red ochre on it because it was thought to be used that way. In volume 2, it's more of its natural color. But both of those were done by a Native American artist named Ren Harvey, who's a good friend of mine, who did
Hmm.
those specifically for the book.
Yes, I know Ren Harvey. I know Ren Harvey.
Do you? Yeah. So
Yeah, he's awesome.
she's done some other artwork for Seven Ages and for me personally. I'm looking at some of her stuff on the wall right here. But yeah, she's a wonderful lady, and
Yep.
she did that.
Love Ren.
Yeah, she did the artwork covers for us. And so it's there on the cover, but yeah, there's a whole chapter 6, dedicated to those enigmatic pieces, and they are truly unique. I would say the only thing from art culture concerning the Adena that is more impressive than the pipe or than the tablets would be the Adena pipe. So,
Hmm.
the official artifact of the state of Ohio. But that particular piece is just jaw-droppingly phenomenal. But it's a lot to talk about their culture. One more note I think is something I think is really interesting, and it's worth talking about, is mixed in with that ritual landscape. So we have the wolf shaman or the wolf priest or priestess, whatever you want to call it. We have a precedent set from burials with that. But also we have these tablets when we're trying to figure out how they were incorporated into the cosmology. But we also have Nicotiana rustica, which is that famous tobacco strand that is known amongst the Adena and the later Hopewell. Uh, that particular plant, I think, also probably played a very significant role in their ritual landscape.
Hmm.
So, modern tobacco, you go buy a pack of cigarettes, which hopefully you're not doing that these days, but normal types of tobacco have about 1.5% amount of nicotine. Nicotiana rustica has up to 18.5%, which is
Wow.
unreal. Um,
You're seeing stars. Yep.
that will make you hallucinate, like straight
Mhm.
up. It can kill you.
Hmm.
So you can actually OD on nicotine,
Wow.
and is the kind that can actually take you out.
Mm.
But that's what they were using. They were using that to contact the spirit world or to go into whatever zone that they needed to go into to retrieve whatever it was they needed for the ritual landscape.
Mm.
We see it later with the Hopewell. There's even some very fun theories about it being traded as almost a monetary system of you bring us cool stuff from far places away and we'll give you some of this Nicotiana rustica. So
Nice.
they could have been the earliest dealers out there on the Ohio
Yes.
River.
Wow, amazing.
Can't confirm that, but it would have been that desirable. It would have been something that would have, uh, it would have been used in such a way that it would have carried that desire because we know from the effigy pipes and we know from the block-in tube pipes that we find throughout the Adena world that obviously the consumption of tobacco was a very important ritual. It was a very important part of daily life. So to have a powerful strand like that, maybe it wasn't used all the time,
Yeah.
or they probably knew how to moderate it, I'm sure. But it was an important part of the culture and probably something that shouldn't be overlooked because when you're talking ritual landscapes, cosmologies, um, it's not unusual, as we all know, that many people throughout history use some sort of substance to kind of jumpstart that uh, that movement into the spiritual realm or into the other. You got to kind of get yourself there. You got to have something to help you get there.
Right.
So I think all of those things collectively, the Adena tablets, the Nicotiana rustica, the the way that the mounds are built, it's all indicative of a ritual landscape. It gives us, if it's 1,000-piece puzzle, it gives us maybe 100 pieces to try to figure
Right.
it out. Yeah.
And each of those pieces are extremely fascinating in their own right. Now, I know we're getting close to an hour, but there was one question, one topic, and this is you might get mad at me for bringing up such a contentious topic right at the end, but I feel like we might as well talking to the Adena guy right now, but I wanted to ask you about the Great Serpent Mound. Now, we don't need to get into all the nitty gritty of the debate as to whether or not it's an Adena site or whether or not it's a Fort Ancient site. But I'm just curious if you could talk to the listeners and just kind of say what evidence there is for it being an Adena site, and then also maybe how it kind of fits into this cosmology, this culture that we're talking about of sacred landscapes, rituals, tobacco use, stuff like that.
Lee, I have no dog in this fight.
Fair enough.
I just went there and I looked at the information. I've been there twice. I looked at what was available, what had been done, where the research had been in the past, where it is now, who sampled it, who dated it, and what the revised dates look like. And I just reported on what the scientific documentation says.
Mhm.
So, as far as the Serpent Mound goes, it is certainly, without a doubt, regardless of who's responsible for creating it, is one of the most magnificent earthworks in the world, and not just North America, in the world. It is solely unique. Of course, there's other serpent mounds. Most people aren't aware of that. There's other serpent mounds. There's other serpent earthworks. Some are made of stone. Some are made of earth. They're in Europe. They're in Asia. They're in other parts of North America. Some are controversial, but this is a clear-cut, no doubt about it, serpent mound. Now, Frederick Ward Putnam was kind of the pioneer of the investigation into this. So we're talking, 1800s, but he's the first one to really recognize the importance of this. It's important to know, too, that he did a lot of work on the site. So he did a lot of restoration. He did a lot of filling in of gaps. He did a lot of, kind of scooping up and repairing and reshaping of the mound, which will come into play here momentarily. As we fast forward, though, there is a rather large Adena mound on the property. It has been excavated and confirmed to be Adena. So Frederick Ward Putnam was aware of that and had checked it out himself. Of course, the term Adena wasn't being used, but it was his natural assumption that whoever built that mound right there is the same people that built the Serpent Mound, which, as we found out later, were Adena. So it's right there on the property. If you go to the parking lot, it's right in front of you to the right of the gift shop and the museum. So that it was an Adena mound. Of course, there were other things found out the property, Fort Ancient, you know, obviously something something as profound as the Serpent Mound would have been used by every culture that discovered it. So you probably have, I think it's safe to say, you have whoever built it, probably multiple restorations throughout the woodland period, a probably second use by the Fort Ancient at a much later period, and then restorations, additions. There's some good GPR and other things that show that parts of it may have been altered, parts of it may have been erased. So there's a precedent there for long-term use, probably by multiple cultures. Why would you not use it if you found it, right?
Mhm.
Not to mention, though, the argument, if you will, that uh, it was first attributed to the Adena. Later dating, carbon dating samples that were taken, they attributed it to Fort Ancient. So there's been arguments back and forth over the years. Some saying that the Adena have no serpent iconography or no association with the serpent, where the Fort Ancient culture does. That is not true. If you look at many Adena burials, it's not uncommon to find serpents placed between the legs that would have been in a bag of some sort when they were buried. So there is an attachment to serpents. And it's hard to say that because almost every indigenous culture has some sort of attachment to serpents,
Hmm.
whether it's from a cosmological aspect or whether it's from something you see in South America, Asia. I mean, it's a very, very common, whether it's Mayan, Inca, they all have it. So it's hard to say, well, this culture had it and this one didn't.
Hmm.
But what we see is the more recent dates that were done were more extensive. They were cored down to the very bottom of the mound. There were 8 of them, and they all seem to indicate a Adena date versus a Fort Ancient date.
Hmm.
The Fort Ancient samples, though we'll just call them that, have some issues because where they were taken from, how they were taken, they were more likely the remains of Frederick Ward Putnam's repair jobs, meaning the ground that he scraped up and placed on the
Yeah.
mound was actually what was being tested. That would obviously give it a Fort Ancient date because it was taken from a much higher strata in the ground. So by
Hmm.
doing those cores down, multiple cores down through the body, getting down to the base layer, and then being able to radiocarbon date that would indicate that it is indeed a Adena construction.
Hmm.
Now, with that being said, you could continue to redate, but it's very, very hard again because of the repairs, because of um, the way that it's been maintained over the years. Ultimately, I don't really think it matters which culture made it. I think that the fact that it contains obvious astronomical alignments, especially the summer solstice sunset, is perfectly aligned with the head. You
Right.
have the undulations of the body that align with various astronomical alignments. These are all covered in the book. I just don't want to bore people with degrees and all of that stuff. But you can
Right.
look at
Right. No
you can
worries.
look
Yeah.
it up for yourself. It's a very complex thing, and that kind of leads us back to the Adena tablets. Because if you look at let's take the Cincinnati one since it's the most popular and people can visualize that one easier. If you turn it long ways horizontally, you'll notice these hash marks on both sides. And so if you really dig into it and you start looking at the alignments, there's been some very interesting work done by archaeologist William F. Romaine from Ohio, who has shown some pretty convincing astronomical alignments that are present on the tablet itself, such as moon phases and you know various. There's quite a few different alignments, but I covered it in detail in the book. So if you have that sort of present on these portable tablets that you can kind of carry around with you, but then you also have it at the Serpent Mound. And of course, you got to realize too that the Serpent Mound is in a very unique location. So on that ridge that sticks out, but that's an old meteor impact crater, which a lot of people don't even realize because it's huge. It's massive.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is, from, I think it's over 100 million years ago. It's not any time recent. But you also have water coming from two sources that kind of parallel where the Serpent Mound is, which is a very important thing for indigenous belief, and specifically the Adena. We often see constructions on the intersection of waterways, and you see that with the Serpent Mound. So you have the creek below, and you have one coming down the other side. So there's lots of anomalies and other things when you really get in there and look at the property and walk around it, especially if you go down from the mound into those creek bottoms. There's some cave-looking structures and other things that are there. It's very, very interesting, and I'm sure there was a lot of things coming and going and happening around that, regardless of who built it. So I would say, regardless, I don't really care who built it. I think it's magnificent, and it's one of the most incredible things that anybody can see, especially in Ohio. But if we're getting down to brass tacks, I would say that the current, as of 2026, it appears to be an Adena construction.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for taking the time and discussing this Adena culture. Very fascinating conversation, and I very much appreciate your time. So before we go, Jason, where can listeners want to get more of your content and what you're putting out? Where can people find you?
Well, we can be found at sevenages.org. And we also have the 7 Ages Audio Journal podcast. We usually do one episode a month. We've been going for about 9 years now. That's available on all podcast applications. So yeah, of course, we ask people to please subscribe to those. We're available on YouTube as well. And of course, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and that's pretty much it for social media. But yeah, if anybody has any questions for me or would like any information, you can find me at jason@sevenages.org. And of course, you can also message me online or anywhere like that. But
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason.
Thank you, Lee. I appreciate it.